I played with Judd and I played with Mommy. Now I want to play with you.
We're talking Pet Sematary tonight.
Is it just me? Or is it getting crazier out there?
Not since The Shining had a book been rooted in events so closely tied to King's own life and experience. In 1978, the same month that Doubleday released the Stand, King moved his family to Orrington, Maine, so that he could spend a year at the university teaching English. And their house was on Route 15, where a lot of trucks would go by. And his wife, Tabitha, was terrified that their youngest child would run out into the road. And it turned out it wasn't their son that he had to worry about. On Thanksgiving, a car killed their daughter's beloved cat, Smucky. And poor Smucky, R.I.P. So Stephen King and Tabitha struggled with what to tell their daughter. Do they say that the cat had just run away, or do they tell her the truth that the cat had died? Ultimately, they opted for the latter, and a move that they think that was the right choice. Now, on the property of their home was a pet cemetery, misspelled by the local children, where they would bury their beloved deceased pets. And that's where they ended up burying poor little Smucky. And during this time, King wondered, well, what if Smucky came back to life? And he began writing his manuscript for the novel Pet Sematary. He showed it to Tabitha, who reportedly hated it. And he also showed it to friend and fellow author Peter Straub, who also thought it was way too dark and too terrifying. And the book just kind of sat there for several years until it was finally published in 1983. Mostly as a screw you to Doubleday, who kind of had their fangs in Stephen King with contracts. So he published it as a way to get out of a contract that he was in with the Doubleday Publishing Company. And to this day, it is one of Stephen King's most dark, depressing, deeply unnerving novels. And as much as he had approached horror prior to that and in the long time since, this is still regarded as definitely one of the most terrifying, because it resonates so much with the wide audience. I think there is no horror a person and a parent could conceive of that is greater than the loss of your child. And Pet Sematary really deals with that. And I would highly recommend listening to the audiobook read by Michael C. Hall, who most people know him from Dexter and 6 Feet Under. I've read Pet Sematary maybe 2 or 3 times, and then about a year ago, I listened to the audiobook. And Michael C. Hall's performance and narration is absolutely astounding. The emotions that he brings, and even voicing the other characters, whether he's voicing the protagonist Louis Creed, voicing his wife Rachel, voicing the kids Ellie and Gage, this being a grown man saying the dialogue of an 8-year-old girl or a 3, 4-year-old little baby, it seems like it shouldn't work, but it really does. And he is such an incredible talent. But I remember one night sitting on my porch listening to this, and it was this scene where Lewis exhumes his son's grave in preparation to bring him to the burial ground. And I actually cried, and I did not, it didn't affect me that way when I was just reading it. And it didn't really affect me that way watching the first film adaptation. But definitely, if you can listen to that, highly recommend. It just brings out the story in such a marvelous way. Yes, just wanted to shout that out there. It's so good. But I think when a lot of people think about Pet Sematary, more so than even the novel itself, they think about the original film adaptation from the 80s. And that's kind of interesting to me because I do love the movie. It's very nostalgic for me. But aside from some key performances and key moments, it's not, I don't think it's actually that great of a film. And Stephen King himself wrote the screenplay, and it was directed by Mary Lambert, who was mostly known for directing music videos. And Madonna's Like a Prayer was probably the thing she was known most for. And I don't think it's a matter so much of the structure of the film. I don't know. It's a weird one for me because there's so much in it that I really, really do love and appreciate, but a lot of it is a little dull. And I'm sorry to say, I mean, I'm sure he is a very, very nice guy and probably very good in other things, but Dale Midkiff as Lewis Creed, aside from maybe 2 scenes, his performance just does not really do it for me. He's very one note, he is not very expressive, and there are so many scenes where he is just sitting and talking with Judd, played by the legendary Fred Gwynne. And it's almost unfair. The scope of performances and the just charisma is just so off kilter between these two. And Fred Gwynne, I think, is one of the things we think about when we think of Pet Sematary, when he really goes hard on the main accent, the and sometimes dead is better. And the, what's the other line? Oh, the soil of a man's heart is stony, Lois. And his accent is so written in the novel. I love how Fred Gwynne brings that to life. And he's so good. And another thing about the 89 film that I love is little Miko Hughes as Gage. Oh my goodness, this little baby, and he's not like a baby, but this small child, such an incredible, adorable little actor. And they actually really had to fight to have him cast in the movie. The 2 girls who played the elder child, Ellie, were a set of twins, and that's a very common thing in film and television, casting twins to play child characters. It's easier for the kids. It's cheaper for the studio. But seeing little Miko Hughes, they really had to campaign to get him to play Gage. And oh my gosh, I am so glad they did, because this movie would not be as well remembered and as beloved if it wasn't for him. First of all, he is just the cutest kid like you could ever conceive of, with his blonde hair and his big eyes. He's just so adorable. And then when he is resurrected after being hit by a semi truck on the road and buried and exhumed and buried again in the pet cemetery, you know, he is able to deliver that creepiness. And, you know, creepy kids in horror movies and just in horror stories are kind of a trope of all their own. But that you have like the cutest kid imaginable slicing the Achilles tendon of Fred Gwynn and saying these creepy lines. And it is kind of funny because there are parts where obviously they just kind of throw a doll at Dale Midkiff. And then it's, you know, it's Miko Hughes again, and then it's a doll, and then it's Miko Hughes. It's kind of funny. But he's just so good. And the scene where he is killed a second time, when Lewis realizes that his child is no longer his beloved child, and injects him with a poison, and he cries out in pain, and then his little lip quivers, and he goes, "No fair, no fair." And it is both it's heartbreaking and adorable and creepy. But then when he collapses, and it looks like this poor little kid just really smacked his head on the wall. So, he was fine. And interestingly, Miko Hughes, he went on, and then in '94 was in Wes Craven's New Nightmare, playing the son of Heather Langenkamp. And the makeup team that did the makeup effects and the prosthetics on this movie would end up being the team that Heather Langenkamp herself would end up working for, along with her husband. So I just think that is very, very cool. And Wes Craven's New Nightmare, that is one I want to talk about at some point, because gosh, do I love that movie. And it's got some fun meta horror and meta commentary that Wes Craven would really go hard on later on in the 90s with Scream. But anyways, in the '89 Pet Sematary, aside from Fred Gwynn, aside from adorable little Gage, and the gray kitty who plays Church, I think what has become the nightmare fuel for most people is the character of Zelda. Now, Zelda was Rachel's sister, who had spinal meningitis and died when Rachel was young. And Rachel was alone when her sister passed away. And the disease, which I really don't think this is how the actual disease works, but her body is contorted and she's screaming out for her sister, and she ends up just choking on her food and choking on herself and dying. And they cast a grown man to play this teenage girl dying of spinal meningitis, and which just adds to the creepiness and kind of uncanniness of it. And the character of Zelda is, for Rachel, where her uncomfortability with death really begins. Rachel's family pushed aside Zelda, and after her death, never really spoke of her again. She was sort of the family's dirty secret. And it completely traumatized Rachel, to the point where she can't talk about death. And when faced with death, with first the death, or what would have been the death of Church, the cat, and then with Gage, you just see how this family just cannot accept and deal with death itself. And that is where that is kind of the launching point of Pet Sematary. You have Lewis talking to Ellie and, saying that death is a natural part of life, and Ellie can't accept that her cat might die, and she said, "Let God have his own cat. He can't take mine," which is something that Stephen King's own daughter said about little Kitty Smokey. But even though as a dad, Lewis is trying to say and do the right thing, once confronted by death himself, first he rejects it, partly because of Judd, who brings him to the burial ground beyond the pet cemetery itself, where things that are buried there are brought back to life. This is done as a favor to Ellie, that so she doesn't have to confront death yet. She's too young. But then when Gage dies, we see how unprepared and unwilling this family is to accept death. And really, and I understand that, I think anybody could, but the influence of the burial ground itself, the actual cemetery, reaches out and sours everything and everyone around it. And that is something that neither film adaptation really fleshes out, how the burial ground itself is just old and evil and was soured at some point in history. And that leaches out like poison in the water to the rest of the people. And once you know that it's there, it infects you and it draws you in. And even though you know that the person, whatever you bury there, is not going to return as their same self. It's going to be a twisted, warped, murderous version of the thing you loved, but you still go and you do it anyway. And that aspect to me is very fascinating. And one, I wonder, say if it were myself, or maybe if it were any of you and a loved one died, if you could bring them back, even knowing the horrible consequences, would you do it? And if you are also compelled by this very old, very, excuse me, just these dark forces, would you be powerless to stop yourself? And that is something that the 2019 adaptation of Pet Sematary, I do think, approaches a little bit better than the 89 one. And, the 2019 Pet Sematary. I am still conflicted with how I feel about that movie. I saw it in theaters, and I really wanted to love it. The trailers, I looked really great, but I will get back to something. I'll circle back to the trailers for this movie. But my experience watching the movie was also soured because of teenagers who would not stop talking and laughing and were really disruptive. And now, old man shakes fists at clouds and you darn kids. But that really that really did hinder just the overall experience of watching the movie. But the 2019 adaptation, there's a lot of, like, it's very divisive because of a very big change it makes. Now, in the novel, and then in the 89 adaptation, it's little Gage who is killed on the road. They changed that in the 2019 version. In this one, it is the older child, Ellie, who is struck by the semi and dies. And I know, some people loved it, some people hated it. I think that was a great choice. Because if you're going to do another adaptation, and I'm not going to call it a remake of the 89 version because it's its own thing. But if you are going to do a new version of it, why not make it something new? Why not make a change? Even Stephen King himself heralded it and, basically said the same. Like, why do it the exact same way? If you're going to redo it and readapt it and do a different vision, it's like doing a cover of a song. Why do it exactly the same way then just leave it alone? So I really like that they did that. And the young actress who played Ellie, I think, was absolutely astounding. She did a fantastic job. And the way that they have the makeup effects for her after she is resurrected, with her one eye is sort of half shut, and at one point Lewis is brushing her hair and clumps come out and you can see the staples on her head. It's very, very unnerving, and she does a phenomenal job. But for me, having that change would have cemented the 2019 Pet Sematary as a much better movie in my mind than what I ultimately end up thinking about it. But the trailers gave it away. I was so upset that the trailer shows that it's Ellie who dies instead of Gage. And I wish in an alternate universe that had not been a thing. And because to experience that shock and the realization that, like, okay, like, here we go, Gage is gonna die. Like, oh my, what? They did Ellie? Oh my God. I wish I could have had that reaction. And the directors defended their choice of putting that in the trailer as a sort of, like, as a, they were being defensive about it from the get-go. And they were like, okay, people are going to be mad about this, so we have to project it so they know that we're going in a different direction. And I really think that they
Drop the ball.
dropped the ball, screwed the pooch, buried the cat, unburied the cat, however you want to say it. But man, that was such a bummer that it was given away, because that would have been such a shock to the system and such a welcome change. Like, or just like, wow, they went there. That's crazy. I'm in. Let's see how this goes. Yeah, my take on the entire film would have been so much better if that had been a surprise. And unfortunately, with that being given away, it really did decrease my enjoyment of the film as a whole. And it's not that it's a bad movie. I think as far as a film, overall, it is much better done and overall has better performances than the 89 version. And I'll probably get some hate for that, but Overall, the actors are more competent across the board than in the 89 version. And, that's not to say that the performances weren't good in Mary Lambert's film. I think Denise Crosby did a fine job, and in some scenes she was fantastic. Her voiceover narration talking about Zelda and Zelda's death is really, really well done. But that's the thing. I think Dale Midkiff's performance in the 89 film really drags the movie down in general. The one scene where he really does sell an emotion is when he screams no after Gage is killed. That is well done, and I like the construction of that scene. It's so tense. In every time I watch it, I know that he's not going to catch Gage in time, but I'm still hoping that he will. And it does an interesting thing where he screams no, and then it does a flash of Rachel in the hospital holding newborn Gage, and then a flash to another photo of the family. And it's a bit odd, but I really like it. I think it is a very good visual representation of what your mind kind of goes through when presented with the sudden death of someone you love so much. You can just focus on these happy moments or just these moments in time, and juxtaposed with the realization that this person is gone and you couldn't save them. So yeah, that was great in the 89 version. And in the 2019 version, overall the performance, Jason Clarke, I think he does a really, really good job as Lewis. Again, though, that's the thing with adapting Stephen King's works from novels into film. It can be very difficult because so much of his writing is very much in the characters' heads, and you have inner monologues and just concepts and ideas that translate very well on the page and work in your imagination, but are very difficult to be done visually and in a film medium. And I think a lot of adaptations of Stephen King works do suffer from that because so much of it is very interior, and trying to put that out there a lot of times doesn't work. So the character of Lewis is just kind of hard to nail down in a film medium. But I think Jason Clarke does very well with what he is given, and he definitely shows a lot more emotion, and you see the things going on behind his eyes that we just don't get from Dale Midkiff's performance. Now, Judd Crandall was played so well and so iconically by Fred Gwynne. And he is played by John Lithgow in the 2019 version. And I love John Lithgow as an actor. He is absolutely fantastic. But at this point, I think he kind of made a name for himself as a villain character. He famously played the Trinity Killer in Dexter, and I think a lot of people still remembered him as voicing Lord Farquaad in Shrek. And, very distant from Third Rock from the Sun and other projects he'd been on. So his performance as Judd comes across to me as almost sinister. And I don't know if that's just me projecting onto him or if that is just really how he comes across. But what I do like about his performance and the writing of the 2019 version is, as I was saying a bit before, you do see that there is a moment where you can tell that the dark magic, the dark forces, whatever you want to call it, resonating from the burial ground turns a light on in his brain or turns it off. When he sees that Church has been hit by the truck and he's talking to Lewis, he kind of does a turn, and it is like he has been grabbed and is influenced to bring Lewis beyond the storefront pet cemetery, take him over the deadfall through the woods to the burial ground, and that sets everything else in motion. And I do like that was more implied in the movie than it had been in the 89 version. I think that's very interesting, and because that is something I never could really wrap my mind around with Judd, who himself, he knows what happens when you bury something or someone in the burial grounds, but whether it's out of mercy for Ellie or it's against his better judgment, but he still does show Lewis. And I think the idea that he was being influenced by the cemetery itself is a good way to explain that. And that's something that I like. Now, the ending of the 2019 film version is something else that people have talked about a bit, and I don't know how I feel about it. In theory, I think I like it, but I do prefer the novel's ending. And throughout the movie, you have all these ruminations on death and grief. And that all just kind of gets a bit sidelined for a almost schlocky ending. We have just a lot of stabbings going on, and then it almost is funny the way that it's presented. It's just goes so hardcore into, okay, we took this journey here, and now everybody's going to the pet cemetery. Okay, Rachel's dead. She's getting dragged to the pet cemetery. And then Lewis is killed. He's stabbed through the chest, and the whole family is happily reunited and brought back to life. And the last shot is the three of them, Lewis, Rachel, and Ellie, coming up on the car where Gage is locked inside, and it just ends with the sound of the car being unlocked, and we can only assume that they kill little Gage and bring him, and they're just a family of undead whatevers. Now, the novel and the 89 film, it ends with Gage killing Judd, killing Rachel, being killed by Lewis, and then at this point, Lewis is out of his mind. He, through both grief and the influence of the burial ground itself, he takes Rachel back, and he's just trying to rationalize it for himself that, Gage was dead for too long. Rachel's been dead for so much shorter. It'll work this time. And it's implied in the book that we don't really know what happens to Lewis. The last thing we know is that he hears Rachel stagger on home and put her hand on his shoulder and just say, "Darling." In the 89 film adaptation, have a very gross looking Rachel come back, and they just kiss, and they're in a very deep, passionate kiss despite her almost missing half of her face. And then she raises a scalpel, and you hear off screen Lewis yell, so we can assume that she murdered him. And I think that ending is, I think it's a bit more subtle than what the 2019 one did. I do prefer it. The way that, so they both end with houses being set on fire, with Lewis, I think in the 2019, I think it's Ellie who lights Judd's house on fire. But in the novel and then in the original adaptation, it's Lewis who burns down Judd's house. And the way they did it in the 89 film was very cool. So they just built a facade around an existing house and just burned it down and left the existing structure there, but just burned this facade around it, which I think is very, very neat. And one thing that the 2019 version does that I really applaud is the approach of the burial ground itself. And now this can get a little but in the book, it is the Micmac tribe that had this burial ground. And although it is implied that it wasn't until more colonization that the ground went sour, but it does kind of, and Stephen King did this a few times earlier in his career with The Shining. The Overlook Hotel was built on Indian burial ground. In Firestarter, you have a Native American killer. And then in Pet Sematary, there's the Micmac burial ground and the legend of the Wendigo, which was more of an Algonquin legend. But the 2019 version just kind of doesn't go into like the magical other aspect of that. And what they do, and it's told, Judd has a sort of old history books and storybooks. It is basically that this land, this place, had almost exists out like in and of itself. It's almost out of its own. It has its own gravity. It was there long before any of the Native American tribes were around. It was there while they were there. They just knew to avoid it, and it was there after them. It was no part of their own culture or heritage that led to the burial ground being what it was. And I think that was a smart move on the film's part. Now, the Wendigo itself as a concept is very interesting to me because in the original folklore and Native American legends, the iconography of the Wendigo itself is far, far different than what modern audiences would look at a thing and say, oh, that's the Wendigo. What we think of usually a giant creature with either antlers or ram's horns. That did not come about until the early 20th century. And partly because of Pet Sematary is what has cemented that idea of the Wendigo in pop culture and in so many other horror movies, where the original legend and the Wendigo is a metaphor for greed, and it's cannibalistic in nature. And itself, it's a gaunt being that can never, no matter how much it eats, can never be full. And I just think it's very interesting how the image of the Wendigo has changed because of different versions of the tale and popularized by other things, Pet Sematary being one of them. And I know I mentioned this in I can't remember what video, but it's Wendigo, not Wendigo. Again, love Supernatural, but every time they say it, it just rankles me so much. But anyway, yes. So, Pet Sematary, I think why it has remained in the public consciousness so much since its publication in 83, and why it's, considered one of Stephen King's most terrifying tales is for one, it's the horror of kind of the zombies and vampires. There is a horror of that, in that your loved one is brought back, but the twist of the knife is that they are not who you actually loved, who you remembered. They are a twisted, evil version of that. So that, there is that element of the horror, but also that no matter what lies we tell ourselves, tell our children, no matter how much we like to sugarcoat things or try to say that, death is natural, it's a part of life, and which is true, but we're never ready for it when it comes. Whether I think people are generally much more accepting of their own deaths versus the death of somebody they love, especially that being of a child, and that you can't escape it and you have to confront it and you can't run from it. And it's going to come for you. It's going to come for the people you love. And if you try to mess with that natural order, only horror can come of that. And something that we can't change. And if by some magical realism or some way we do change it, it's never good. And the heart of it is something that it's very difficult for us to accept, but at some point we have to. That sometimes dead is better. And that's where I'm going to end it, on that very depressing and dark note. But hey, that's that's the book Stephen King wrote, and I'm not going to try to make it more lighthearted because even he couldn't do that. He still thinks it is horrible and awful because it is so dark and depressing. So have a great night, spookies. No fair. No fair, Stephen King. No fair. Stay spooky, my friends.